As we look around at the state of adoption today, many of us don't have any concept of where adoption has come from. I've recently talked to author Andrea who has written 2 books about writers of America's orphan trains. This was a unique period in America's adoption journey that had its own ups and downs. In describing the situations that led to the train, there is a mention of violence against children. As we get started, Andrea discusses how she got interested in this story and then gets into what she's learned along the way, this time on Adoption Uncovered.
So it wasn't until I was an adult, I was established as a magazine writer. I had tons of assignments from major women's magazines, educational magazines, psychology, health. There were all these different fields. And I was in New York City and visiting with an editor I was doing some work for, actually at Family Circle. And something came up about finding permanent placement for foster home children. And I said to her, well, that sounds a lot like the orphan trains. And she just said, what are you talking about? So, I'd never researched it, but I knew a little bit about it. And so I told her, well, they put these kids on these trains and took them west, and they'd stop at stations along the way. None ever came into the little town where I lived, but they came all around that community. And I knew several of them growing up. And these were orphan train riders. And she was so intrigued that I walked out of there with an assignment to write about the trains. And so that's really where that began. It began as a research assignment for a magazine, but now I was off and running. So the next thing was thinking about it from a teaching perspective. I could have used a book like that in a classroom. Kids often hate history because, frankly, the textbooks can be so boring, and they love history, but they hate history class. So I thought, I could see already that there was so much involved. First of all, why would there be all these orphan children? And secondly, why are they all out in the East Coast? And who thought up this idea of the trains? And so, you think about the time period, you think immediately about westward migration, which is how everybody came to live where I was living. You thought about the Industrial Revolution. You thought about immigration and immigration patterns. These kids were almost all from Western Europe. There were, a few Black children, especially after the Civil War, but it was very hard to place them. So there weren't many. There are so few that they're not even documented. We just know that there were some. But, we weren't moving these kids from west to east. We were moving them from east to Midwest and further west. So there are just all kinds of threads of history to catch here. The trains were so busy after the Civil War because so many children lost their fathers in that war. And mothers couldn't support their kids, or if the mother died young, could leave a large family. Same situation you had with the immigrants. Anyway, that's where the idea for the first book came. And I just felt I could write a factual history. Absolutely could do that. But, if I was going to write for the students I used to have that age, then let me tell them a story about a kid their age. And let me get these kids who are reading this book to get on that train with him and take that ride. So that's where it started.
Right. Well, that's a great story. I love all those twists and turns you've already had to get you to that story. There were many factors at play that caused orphan trains to seem like an option. Young, poor children faced incredible hardships in places like New York City during the late 1800s and early 1900s. When adults of the time saw them running from authorities and sleeping in doorways, it seemed that something should be done. Can you tell me a little bit about the orphan train? So you talked a little bit about the time period. Can you tell me about what time was that and what was it?
Well, this is starting with the Age of Enlightenment, the Romantic period, when people were finally starting to look at children and not just see them as miniature adults. And there was a lot of pushback starting slowly, get rid of the notion that poverty was a punishment from God, or that poverty was something you deserved. You had some sort of a moral character problem, and this is why you're poor, so quit complaining. And instead, to start seeing children, always in that time frame, because we're talking about the mid 1800s here, through the lens of religion, and to see them as children of God, children who had souls. And, you know, an author like Charles Dickens was playing into this in a big way. So, you know, you have his second novel, Oliver Twist. So Oliver Twist is the lowest of the low. He's born in a workhouse, and his mother immediately dies. And the assumption, of course, because she wasn't wearing a wedding ring the night she staggered into the workhouse to give birth, that this is an illegitimate child. And Oliver Twist's fate will be to die alongside all of the other children in the workhouse who aren't fed enough and are put to work as soon as they can work. And the jobs are all very dangerous, like chimney sweeps and that sort of thing, which happens to Oliver Twist, but he survives. He's just one tough little guy. And he gets through all this. And of course, by the end of the novel, a lot of people thought Dickens sold out when he reveals at the end of the story that Oliver was actually well born, and that he, because the relatives have now found him, he will inherit a fortune. And they just said, you know, come on, why did you do that? Well, he had a very specific reason for doing it, and that was to say to the upper classes, but for fortune, this could be you. And in that story, you know, he lampoons, parodies the workhouses, child crime, all these different conditions that lead people into despair, and often situations that are completely beyond their control. So things are starting to change a bit here. So where before, children, if they can't get somebody to take care of them, they're going to live on the streets, or they're going to be put into these massive orphanages where they were so institutional, these kids often didn't even have names. They were just given numbers and fed right to the brink of starvation practically. And then by the ages of 12 and 14, and this was true in England too, then they're turned out. It was like, go get a job. You know, you made it this far and you're pretty fortunate you did. Now get out of here and go take care of yourself. And I mean, it was a really brutal system. And in England, they were doing the very same thing. So, I mean, you had a scant chance of, and I only say that because of Charles Dickens, because frankly, it was like this pretty much everywhere. So, with some attitudes starting to change, into the 5 Points district in New York City comes Charles Loring Brace. 5 Points, getting into my research on that, revealed an America to me that I had never known existed. It was the largest slum in the world. And, you know, this was, you go to New York and see the area now, but there just aren't any hints anymore of these massive tenements with thousands of people stuffed into them. All these children, again, on the streets, sleeping in doorways, accosted by the elements and by adults who take advantage of them, and, you know, everything else. And because these kids would like steal a loaf of bread just trying to stay alive, the authorities would arrest them. And if you were 10 or older, they might hang you. And if they were going to do that, they would do it in a public square and make sure that street children knew about it and would come to watch this circus of seeing a child hung, because maybe it'll teach them not to do that. So better to lie in the gutter and starve than to steal a loaf of bread and end up being hung. So, I mean, this was what was going on. And Charles Loring Brace was born into a well-to-do family in Connecticut. He was very well educated. He ended up at Union Theological Seminary. While he became ordained as a minister, it was never really his interest to be in the pulpit. He wanted to be a missionary. And interestingly, going to work in the 5 Points district was his missionary work. And so there were, a couple of houses where they were trying hard to help people, but the problem was so overwhelming. When he went to work there. He went to work in a Methodist mission. He was Presbyterian, didn't matter, Protestant. That's what mattered. Catholic, Jew, Protestant, that religious designation was very important. Very few Jewish children rode those trains either. They usually baptized them as either Catholic or Protestant, mostly Protestant if it was Children's Aid Society, Catholic if it was a New York Foundling Hospital. And only a Catholic family would take a Catholic child, only a Protestant family would take a Protestant child, so forth. And there just weren't that many Jewish families available. But there was some placement of that. I mean, there are always, when you think of as possible as many of as 250,000 children rode these trains, you've got every kind of story you can imagine. And nobody was keeping good statistics on any of this. The laws were so fluid at this time. And, most of the states weren't even states, they were still territories. So back to Charles Loring Brace, he's working in this mission, and there's public drunkenness, and everybody's coughing and hacking because it's a coal burning city, and they're all sucking this coal dust into their lungs. And it's looking pretty hopeless. London was the same way, and Dickens describes the same thing in his books. And he found himself more and more focusing on the children. And some of it was this problem of how other people felt about them, that they're poor kids. What can you do? They're a bad element. Just they're beyond hope, or they're not worth it. And he felt just the opposite. And what he ended up doing, I'm simplifying the story, is he started, because he was so well connected because of his family and everything, he started raising money and joined with some other people, including several other ministers, to start what became quickly known as the Children's Aid Society. Children's Aid Society of New York. There were other states that also had Children's Aid Societies, and offering services to relieve the children. So there's a whole range of these. He set up the first daycare center in America for the orphan children of moms who had been widowed. I'm sorry, not the orphan children, the half-orphaned children of moms who'd been widowed and had to work. And there's nobody to take care of the kids. So he put together a cadre, he and these other people, of doctors and nurses to go into the slums and to help with sick babies and to inoculate with the inoculations they actually had at that time, and to get people to the hospital if need be, but just health services. And a lot of advice on baby rearing and that kind of thing. And he started an industrial school for some of these kids so they could learn trades, so that they, the idea was not only would they then not starve, but their families wouldn't starve. They'd be bringing in some income. And in the best of all worlds, actually break the cycle of poverty, actually get them into an occupation where they can support themselves the rest of their lives. England started doing the same thing. There's interesting parallels with the two. And he wanted these kids in school. He felt if you could read or write, that there was such an advantage that you could get a better job because you could do your numbers and that kind of thing. You could read orders if you were going to be a clerk or something. A lot of these kids really didn't speak very good English. They, again, were the children of immigrants who were flooding into New York City at the rate of 1,000 a day. And, when we look at the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, you're poor, that's who was coming in. It wasn't that many rich people who came here. Some people came here and became rich, but it was an awful lot of poor people. In Ireland, they're starving to death. In Europe, they're trying to keep their sons from being conscripted into the armies where they would simply be killed because they were cannon fodder, and there was just war after war after war after war, never stopped. So with these kinds of backgrounds, I mean, literally anything he could do would help. Once he opened the doors of the Children's Aid Society, children found him, and they were hungry and they needed clothes, they needed medical care. They weren't going to school. They were scared. They didn't have any place to sleep. There were a lot of reasons these kids were on the streets. So some of them lost their parents. And if families come over with no brothers or sisters, there's no aunts and uncles. There's no grandparents. So you lose that immediate cushion that most of us have if we grew up in intact families. You had kids who ran away from abusive homes. Alcoholism was just endemic. These fathers would go to work in these factories. They'd labor these long hours. It was very hard. very dangerous, and there was no workers' compensation or anything. And they get off work and they go drinking. I mean, this is just part of it. And kids ran away to get away from the abuse. Kids got lost. You know, it was a huge, huge city. And if they wandered away, they had no way to find their way back. And their families had no way to find them. So, I mean, there are just all these different ways this happened. And so you had a tremendous need. Most major cities in the world did. Certainly London did as well. And what Grace felt above all, for him, it was just fundamental. And of course, some of it had to do with the way he was raised, but it was also what he was learning, was that kids needed families. They needed that kind of structure with people looking after them, caring about them, feeding them, clothing them, getting them to school, getting them to church. That was always a big part of it. And there wasn't any other way to replicate that at that time. You know, I told you what the orphanages were. In fact, they, in some instances, took kids out of those orphanages.
Orphan trains meant the difference between life and death for some children, while for others, it simply traded one harsh life for another. Andrea helps us see the help the orphan trains offered, along with the hurt they also caused.
There's a lot of kind of folk knowledge out there about the trains. Not knowledge, it's you can read all kinds of things on the internet that are not necessarily true about the orphan trains. They were not out combing the streets, picking up kids, or knocking on doors and taking kids away from their parents. This wasn't happening. They became the legal guardians of those children. And you almost never hear a story of them leaving immediately. These kids were not in shape to make those train trips. So they'd go into homes run by the Children's Aid Society, and it might take up to a year to even get them healthy enough to put them on those trains. They'd never been to an eye doctor. They'd never been to the dentist. They'd never been to a doctor. They needed their hair cut. They were thin. They were sick. They couldn't read and write. You know, it depends on the ages. These kids who rode the trains were anywhere from infants on up to really the oldest is about 14. I suppose there are some exceptions to that. You know, you might read stories, but it would be an exception. And again, this goes back to by the age of 12 to 14, you're adult enough to go out and support yourself. So, and you just weren't going to find people who are going to take kids older than that. You know, that as today, the same problem today, the older the child, the tougher it was to get a placement for them because, hey, you know, they've been living on the streets. They knew too much. They came with bad habits. They smoked, whatever. And the advantage that the older children had is they could be put to work. And there is no way around that fact that an awful lot of those kids were picked for that reason and that reason alone. And the only justification I can give it, which I think is valid, is that at that time, all kids worked. If you were 3 years old, you had chores because there was so much work. It was so labor intensive, hand work. We didn't have electricity. I mean, they didn't have electricity. They didn't have the kind of things we have today that are time savers. So being taken and put to work, you know, what they tried to do with the Children's Aid Society was you had to sign this contract and it said that you would educate the child. So there's school. But the truth is, if a farmer took a 10-year-old girl or boy and had a 10-year-old girl or boy, that 10-year-old farm child was working when they needed that child on the farm, you know, when the crops were coming in and that kind of thing. And then, you know, in the dead of winter, they got to go to school. and that was just a common pattern. So when you hear this criticism that they were just taken to work, not if the Children's Aid Society could help it because of this requirement that they also go to school. But of course, it couldn't always enforce it. So
Right. So they put these orphans after they had been made healthy and put them on the trains. How did they find the families to connect them with?
So now we're going to talk about the weak link here.
Okay.
And there was a weak link in this system. So what they did, and again, we're talking about the Children's Aid Society, and there were a lot of other groups that did this. I mean, anybody could form an orphan train. It's just that they were the first. and they were the model. And they were Protestant. And so the
Okay.
kids who rode their trains, forget that Jewish name. Now you have a new name. Now your name is, and you are a Protestant. I mean, they baptized them. They gave them Bibles. They
Okay.
taught them Bible verses. They turned them into Protestants. And I interviewed a woman who was raised as a Protestant out in central Kansas. And she just always felt there's something missing. Something isn't right here. And as an adult, when she was able to finally trace her biological family, they were all Jewish. And she found this big, wonderful, warm, and welcoming Jewish family. That was rather miraculous. Most of the kids didn't get that, but that's a story that will illustrate what was happening on this end. So now that to get these homes for these kids, again with the Children's Aid Society, they developed this network of agents working in towns on the railroads, obviously, clear out west and down into the south. I mean, they just sort of had, there's this little town, it's called Opelousas in Louisiana, where they at some point contacted the Foundling Hospital, which was Catholic. And that area of Louisiana had been settled by the French, and a lot of Cajun French, and they were very Catholic. And they'd heard about the trains, and they were, big family kinds of people. And I think it was a priest, but I'd have to go back and check that story. So don't quote me on that one.
Okay.
Actually wrote to the Foundling and said, send children. We'll find homes for them here. We have lots of people who would be happy to take them. And by the time their association ended with the Foundling, which was when the trains stopped for reasons we'll talk about, 2,000 children had been adopted into that small community from the orphan trains.
Wow.
They have a train museum there, and they have a reunion every year. I think they're up to, I don't know, several 100,000 people who trace back to an orphan train relative somewhere in the past. It's a great story, and they were very altruistic. They took care of their own. They watched out for these kids and watched out for them and the families. But so you have this agent somewhere along the line, let's say in Chicago. Okay, you start in New York, you get to Chicago, and the agent there has put up posters. And they did this in Kansas City, where I live. An orphan trains coming to town, homes wanted for needy children, thrown friendless upon the world. We've got 10 boys, 8 girls, gives kind of a physical description, always really tugging at the emotional heartstrings. This was a big deal to really stir up emotions, so that on the day the train came, you might have a little town sitting out somewhere that had 500 people in it. And the day the orphan train came to town, you'd have a couple thousand people there. They'd just come from everywhere in their wagons, to see the spectacle. I mean, it was just so different from their routine, dreary, work-filled lives. And if possible, they tried to get those trains coming through and stopping those places, like on a Saturday. This was the day you went to town to do your errands. And there are so many stories of, usually it's dad. Dad comes to town Saturday to pick up supplies, and there's an orphan train. He doesn't know anything about it ahead of time because he hasn't seen a poster, because they live way out deep in the country, and the train's arriving at 2 or something. And so he's at the depot to watch it along with everybody else. And he sees some child, and he goes, looks just like my little brother Henry looked, at that age or something. And comes home that evening with a real surprise for his wife, because he's got anywhere from 1 to 3 or whatever children with him that he's taken from the train. The stories go up to as many as 7 siblings being taken by a family. I'm not sure I've heard of a story of more being taken, but that's pretty remarkable and unusual.
And so they just come and they take, like, was there any paperwork or signing or anything like that?
Supposedly what was supposed to happen And I know in a lot of places it did happen, but there were too many places where it didn't. There would be this local committee, and they would always be prominent people because they were trying very hard to make this a big deal. You know, they weren't trying to just slip these kids in there. They wanted prominent people involved, and they would okay, you know, they give their permission. The banker would know this farmer and know that he made enough with his crops to pay his mortgage and therefore could afford to take a child, you know, that kind of thing. And again, you signed the paperwork that said you do all these things. Now, adoption doesn't become part of that until after the 1900s. And even then it was not common. It just finally becomes more. Most of these kids were taken more under what we would call an indentured kind of arrangement. There were different kinds of arrangements for this, but you were trying to get people to commit and not say something like, well, we'll just try this out and see. And if it doesn't work, we'll send the child back. And yet, I mean, that happened, but you didn't want people to just on a whim because this little boy looks like your little brother Henry. You know, that's just not a good reason. Unfortunately, it was what motivated a lot of people. So that's the weak link right there, that local committee. And some of them just allowed anybody. And they didn't even know these people. These country folks would come in and they're in town that day and they want to take this child and nobody else wants to take this child. And okay, you know, they sign off on it. And then this poor kid is just in this horrible home. You know, some of these kids ended up living in the barn, never went to school, and just worked. And they were usually the ones who, when they were old enough to do it, would run away. And of course, some of these kids knew, because they were older, that they had family back east. And they knew that, you know, it could have been a situation where dad's dead, mom gets sick, she's got tuberculosis, and they take her to the hospital, and the kids are left alone. And eventually, you know, what we call welfare services would pick up the kids, and they might take them to the Children's Aid Society. And if mom doesn't come and get them, or they can't find mom, they can't trace her, the city's so huge, you know, they put the kids on the train. And later mom shows up, where are my kids? And so here's another, what I would call weak link, except that I think we can all, you and I are adoptive mothers, so this one's a little tougher for us, but they wouldn't tell these mothers, or it could be an aunt or uncle or brother or sister, older brother or sister, they wouldn't tell them where the kids were. Because they felt it was better for the children. When the kids got on the train, a lot of them didn't know what an orphan, what they were. They just thought they were getting a train ride. They didn't know they were being taken, you know, 1,000 miles away to a new home, and didn't want to go. You know, they knew what they were leaving, and it was very, very upsetting. And they were told, "This is a new beginning. You need to forget the past. Start over." I mean, this was their attitude back then. So just forget it. Just put it out of your mind. Oh, that little locket that's got your mother's photo in it. Here, give me that. I'll take care of that for you. And of course, the child would never see it again. And sometimes when they get into these new families, they were given new names. And they might be given the name of a child who died. You know, we lost little August, so now you're our little August. Well, it turns out he's not your little August. And you start realizing that, and you start resenting him a whole lot. And the next time one of the trains comes through town, or one of the agents comes to check to see how the child is doing, little August ends up going back to New York City. So there's just, you know, it's too many kids and not enough supervision out in these areas where all of them were taken. But it's, you know, we didn't have telephones back then. There just was no way to follow through on so much of this. So I've always felt like it was a good-hearted attempt to address this major problem. And you see different estimates. This is where the internet's dangerous. From what I've been able to ascertain, and this is visiting with people like the director of the Children's Aid Society. I happen to actually be in touch with them right now because I have some photo credits I need from them. And, you know, they to the degree that they could track and keep track, they felt like, well, they sometimes said up to 80% of the children had good placements. I think what they identified as good placement meant that the child never ran away or the family didn't. It doesn't mean necessarily a happy placement. Stable might be the better term for that. Some of these kids, because they come from the streets and knew what it was like to not have a warm place to sleep or food for your next meal, even though they went to work and maybe weren't allowed to go to school, still knew that this was better than what they'd come from. And it's now would be up to them to try to figure out what to do with their own lives. They've been given life, then they would have lost it if they'd lived back east. So again, all kinds of stories. I think, whereas the Children's Aid Society says 80%, I could be happy enough. I mean, I've written 2 books about the orphan trains. Doesn't make me an expert, but I think 50%. And even at that, given we're taking a group of kids and you're just taking them west to take their chances, if 50% got what I would call a good home, which I would use the word nurturing there, which we could define different ways, but making the kids feel welcomed and cared for, and I'd like to go so far as to say loved, then to me that's a good home. Again, comparatively speaking.
The orphan trains present yet another imperfect stumble along a path to make sure all of our children grow up in nurturing homes. We still have further to go before we begin to close in on that goal. Hopefully, looking into our past can teach us what to avoid and help encourage us along the journey toward better outcomes for all of our children. To learn more about the books Andrea has written, take a look at my website, adoptionuncovered.com. And thank you. Right.
One last thing is another thing that they did. They tried to keep siblings together, but it just wasn't always possible. I mean, I believe they really tried. It's just that the goal was a home for each child, and a lot of people just, for financial reasons or whatever, just couldn't take more than one child. They couldn't. When the book I wrote, the first one, Orphan Train Rider, One Boy's True Story, about Lee Nailing, Lee went west. They ended up in Texas from New York with two brothers, and they all went into different homes. But they were incredibly fortunate because they were all in the same area, and the family stayed in touch, and the boys were together in the summertime, and great friends as adults. One of them was killed in World War II, so didn't get very far into adulthood. But some of these kids, if you start with 5 kids in New York, and somebody's picked in Pennsylvania, and somebody's picked in Ohio, and somebody's picked in Iowa, and somebody else finally makes it to well, Texas is an example, but any other state, and they lose contact with each other. There's back then, no way to find each other, and that's sad. Again, because last names were changed and stuff. So
Right. And so a lot of this information, is it coming from the like interviews? I know you talked to a number of people that were actually on orphan trains. Is that a prime source of information about this
yes,
event?
I mean that's that's certainly the internal story is interviews with the writers themselves. So because of the ages, I was working on my orphan train material in the mid 1990s, and the writers were anywhere from, let's say, 75 and up, and they would have been the writers who were writing the last trains. So in the 20s, the the oldest person I interviewed, who was in her 90s, had ridden in 1919, but the rest of them were on into the, all throughout the 20s. The trains ended. I actually interviewed a woman at length who wrote a train in 1930. The history books, if you look up orphan trains, it'll say they stopped in 1929, but that's wrong. She was on a train in 1930, and other people were too. It wasn't a big train. It was just a few children, but it's still an orphan train, and it was still in 1930.